Into top stories, National Assembly convenes. Voters go to polls in Jamaica amid surge in COVID-19 cases, and Korean Peninsula battered by its second typhoon in a week. Hello and welcome to the ZIZ News Update. Today is Thursday, September 3rd, 2020. I am your presenter, Shaira Flanders, nationally. Regional security was among the topics of discussion as parliamentarians have been hearing the presentations of 3 bills during today's sitting of National Assembly. The documents that went before Parliament are the Advanced Cargo Information Bill, the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court or Judicial Officers Pensions Bill, and an amendment to the National Assembly Elections Bill. During his presentation, Prime Minister Dr. The Honorable Timothy Harris noted the significance of the Advanced Cargo Information Bill, explaining that the bill will facilitate the sharing of information with other states to identify the cargo and persons that may pose risk to security, while also facilitating trade through electronic data interchange. He said this new bill allows for more information to be collected by the Customs and Excise Department, and the previous manifest system was, quote, inadequate for our contemporary framework and the complex challenges now faced by border control, end quote. He said if the bill is successful, the information provided would help to ensure that the Customs and Excise Department would be in a better position to protect the Federation and the region from threats emanating from international trade. The Advanced Cargo Information Bill had its first, second, and third reading and successfully passed in National Assembly on Thursday. In other news, the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis welcomed a second batch of students from the Ross University School of Veterinary Medicine, or RUSVM, who arrived at the R.L. Batter International Airport on Wednesday, September 2nd. ZIZ understands that a total of 158 students and faculty disembarked the aircraft to prepare for the start of the next academic semester. This group follows the first batch of students who returned to the RUSVM campus after a successful execution of a similar plan in July. The Ministry of Health and the National COVID-19 Task Force collaborated with the Ross University School of Veterinary Medicine to develop a robust plan to facilitate the return of the students. It includes pre-screening for signs of COVID-19, testing for COVID-19 immediately before their return to the Federation, and again immediately upon arrival into St. Kitts. A 2-week quarantine period in on-campus housing under physician care began on the 2nd of September under the supervision of the Royal St. Christopher and Nevis Police Force and the St. Kitts Nevis Defence Force. Chair of the National COVID-19 Task Force, Abdia Samuel, thanked all involved for making the return possible.
I want to thank the Royal St. Christopher Nevis Police Force, the St. Kitts Nevis Defence Force, along with the members of the task force, and also for the members of the HEOC in collaboration with the Ross University faculty, who have been working assiduously on the ground to ensure that all the protocols and procedures are followed to ensure a smooth process. So kudos to everyone who have been working hard to ensure this goes smoothly.
In a statement released by Ross University, Dean of RUSVM, Sean Callanan, stated, quote, our partnership with the government of St. Kitts and Nevis has been instrumental in facilitating a safe return for our students and all community members, end of quote. And as we wrap up local news, a policy has been put in place to allow returning nationals wanting to travel to St. Kitts and Nevis to apply for pre-approved home quarantine. At the September 2nd edition of the NEOC Daily Briefing, Chairman of the National COVID-19 Task Force, Abdia Samuel, revealed that pre-approved home quarantine site applications will now be accepted. He explained the process, which he says begins when persons contact the COVID-19 Task Force via email.
All you have to do now is apply to the task force via the COVID-19 email address, and that is covid19taskforce@gov.kn. After that, an inspection will be done on the property. After the inspection is done, you will then have to reach out to the Office of the Commissioner of Police for the security that will be prescribed to you, which you have to contract. and that will be at your cost. After that is done, then you will be given the necessary permissions to utilize the particular facility for quarantine.
Returning nationals and residents on charter flights are the only persons currently allowed to enter the island. Every traveler is tested before arriving in the country and again immediately after entry. A 14-day mandatory quarantine in a government-designated facility follows, and then another test on the 14th day. We now move to news on the regional scene. Jamaicans head to the polls today to elect a new parliament as the country grappled with a surge in coronavirus infections. Prime Minister Andrew Holness called for the early vote last month in what analysts saw as a bid to capitalize on people's satisfaction with his economic agenda and early response to the virus, according to BBC. But he has faced criticism amid a rise in cases as restrictions are lifted. Face masks and temperature checks will be mandatory in polling stations. Jamaica's parliament has 63 seats and members are elected in a first-past-the-post system. The campaign was dominated by discussions over the economy, how to fight crime, and the coronavirus pandemic. Still on the regional scene, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, or OECS, the International Telecommunication Union, ITU, and the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, have signed an agreement to collaborate on a UNICEF-ITU global initiative to connect every school to the internet and every young person to information, opportunity, and choice. More in this report.
The use of technology as a tool in education is the objective of this initiative, especially after the effects of COVID-19. Through the collaborative efforts of UNICEF, the OECS Commission, and the International Telecommunications Union, this has become a priority in education. Assistant Director of Education, Stacey Payne-Maskell, says the first phase has already been completed.
The first pillar, which is the mapping of the schools, would have started. In fact, they held the conference here in Antigua sometime last year, I think it was in November, where the schools were mapped across the island, and this has happened throughout the OECS as well.
So how will this initiative benefit classrooms in Antigua and Barbuda, particularly in this new normal?
This was evident when we had the lockdown, when we tried as best as we possibly could to reach students via the digital means. And there is a digital divide, especially as it relates to internet access. And so this plans on bringing some level of solution to that particular issue.
Payne-Maskell cannot say how soon the final phase will be implemented.
It is needed within our sector. And so, as the fourth pillar would have suggested, it's about empowering young people to use the internet. And so it goes beyond our school environments, and certainly the home must be must also be taken into consideration as it relates to that improvement.
In the meantime, even apart from the sub-regional program, she's hopeful initiatives being pursued by the government of Antigua and Barbuda will result in all students having internet access at home to bridge the digital divide. Kim Emmanuel Beard reporting for ABS News.
We now move to news on the international scene. A powerful typhoon Maysak has swept up the Korean peninsula, leaving at least one person dead. Al Jazeera's Rob McBride reports from South Korea.
North Korea's east coast cities inundated with floodwaters as Typhoon Maysak drenches the Korean peninsula. Unusual for North Korea, its state-run TV has been carrying live reports of the damage every hour. Maysak had already pounded the South Korean island of Jeju before barreling into the southeastern city of Busan in the early hours of Thursday. At first light, the amount of damage could be assessed, but extensive preparations had kept it to a minimum.
The damage is not as much as I feared. However, it is bigger typhoon than in previous years.
I think a lot of preparations were in place. I think this time we were ready for it.
As the cleanup gets underway here in Busan, people living further up the Korean peninsula are now dealing with the torrential rains brought by this typhoon, many of them living in places already soaked after a summer of extreme weather. North Korea, like the South, was already suffering the effects of Typhoon Bavi last week, which came after unusually severe seasonal rains. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Busan, South Korea.
The United Nations and human rights groups are condemning United States sanctions imposed on the chief prosecutor and another official of the International Criminal Court. Al Jazeera's Patty Culhane reports on that story.
Did U.S. troops torture people? Did they commit war crimes here in Afghanistan? Did the Taliban or the Afghan military? The International Criminal Court has been trying to find out, and now a new move from the Trump administration to try and stop them, at least when it comes to U.S. forces.
The United States will designate ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda and the ICC's head of jurisdiction complementarian cooperation division, Fakiso Mochichuko, for having material assisted prosecutor Bensouda. Individuals and entities that continue to materially support those individuals risk exposure to sanctions as well.
That means the chief prosecutor and the head of an ICC department could be frozen out of the international banking system, have any of their U.S. assets frozen. Human rights groups are outraged.
The practical effect could be significant for these individuals, but I think we also have to see how damaging it is to have a U.S. administration take this position and this kind of a full assault and disregard for the global rule of law that using these sanctions represents.
The spokesman for the UN Secretary General says the move raises concerns.
The ICC, as you know, and especially the prosecutor, are independent of the Secretary General and of the UN. We have always stood for the need for international justice and for the issue of accountability and the fight against impunity.
The U.S. has often used its vast power in the financial industry to punish war criminals, now using the same tactic to go after the very people who are charged with punishing them. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera.
And now for the weather. Present weather is partly cloudy with dust and haze in the vicinity. A gentle breeze of 14 miles per hour is blowing from an easterly direction. Today's temperature will peak at 27 degrees Celsius, that's 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Sunset today will be at 6:22 p.m. and the sun is expected to rise tomorrow at 5:58 a.m. And that brings us to the end of the ZIZ Midday Newscast. Join us this evening for these stories and more in detail. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm your presenter, Shaira Flanders. Have a good one.